Uh, Please note that this webinar will be recorded, so you are welcome to keep your camera off, or if you have any concerns, you can watch the recording later. We will stop recording before our Q&A section with our experts. We are so glad you are all here today. We're here to talk about how the public will be impacted by radiation exposures from the nuclear industry, including waste issues. Um, to really highlight, we are trying to create a respectful and productive discussion. So please remain muted and use the chat feature for your questions and comments, and please engage in respectful dialogue, even when our opinions may differ. We ask that all participants treat our speakers and fellow attendees with courtesy, allowing presenters to finish their presentation before asking questions or making statements. Disruptive, offensive, or disrespectful behavior will result in removal from the meeting to ensure a welcoming environment. And I think one thing we really want to emphasize that while opinions may differ, or we may be the same, or we might have different thoughts on the best book that's out there right now, or best practices, I think we all share a common interest in protecting public health and our environment. Meaningful conversations are strengthened by hearing from a variety of knowledgeable voices. Expertise comes from many places, including scientific research, our technical professionals, public health experts, workers, tribal leaders, and community members with lived experience. We encourage everyone to listen with respect, ask thoughtful questions, and engage in good faith. Before we begin, it's important to recognize the significance of tomorrow, July 16th. It marks the anniversary of the 1945 Trinity nuclear tests in New Mexico, the world's first detonation of a nuclear weapons, and the 1979 Church Rock uranium mill tilling spill on the Navajo Nation, the largest release of radioactive waste in U.S. history. Both events serve as powerful reminders that the impacts of radiation exposure and nuclear development can last for generations. Utah knows all of this firsthand. Please take the time to fill out our form today so we can see where everyone's at. Because those of you may not be calling in from Utah, but those who are, we know this story firsthand. Our state has a long history of radioactive contamination tied to uranium mining, nuclear weapons testing, and radioactive waste. Families, workers, tribal communities, and rural residents continue to live with the health, environmental, and economic consequences of those decisions decades later. That history is why we believe in any expansion of the nuclear industry should be proceeded with caution, transparency, and meaningful public participation, and strong public health protections. Learning from the past is essential if we hope to avoid repeating it. And there are programs out there that remind us of this, including the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that was founded because of Utah residents. And it still reflects the scientific evidence coming out today with the recent expansion of the program. And those experiences are exactly why this moment matters. Utah's rapidly pursuing the entire nuclear fuel chain, including expanding uranium mining, especially with the recent decrease of national monument protections, nuclear reactors that haven't been tested at a commercial scale, and costly reprocessing and waste disposal, which is why we're here today. At the same time, we are told that this industry is well regulated to protect our communities, while the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is considering sweeping changes that would weaken environmental and public health protections. And those decisions will impact our lives in the future. We want to highlight that HEAL believes everyone deserves access to accurate information, meaningful opportunities to participate in decisions about our main issue areas, especially about radioactive contamination and materials. And we emphasize for strong protections in public health and our environment. We thank you for joining us today to learn more about what is nuclear reprocessing, what is nuclear waste, how it can affect you. This is the second in our nuclear webinar series. Our first talked about how radiation impacts the body, how it impacts children and different communities differently. And that's why HEAL's bringing this to you all. We have worked with these experts for many years. I'm so grateful to continue to learn from these experts. And HEAL Utah in our main issue areas of air quality, developing a clean energy future, and preventing and protecting communities from toxic exposures is what we were established for 26 years ago. I need to update this. It's been 26 years. But HEAL has been around protecting communities from toxic exposures for a really long time here in Utah. And this is because we want to develop a safer and cleaner and healthier future that is based on community experience and involvement in decisions. And we ask questions and ensure best practices and work with legislators and work with community members and experts. So we hope that this is a great opportunity for you all to learn from our experts today. We'll get to them shortly, but first I want to highlight all our amazing partners for this series. One of them is on here today, but all of these and many, many more throughout the nation and throughout the world work on these issues, trying to make sure that you are protected, your kids, your families, and future generations and our environment are protected. So if you haven't heard of any of these organizations, go check them out. Um, Oh, I'm zooming past. So why are we here today? We are seeing a new push for a nuclear renaissance, and we know that advancements in technology, in research and science, and understanding lived experience can develop really great opportunities, but we need to make sure that we're not putting the cart before the horse, before the road, before the trail. We need to understand that the nuclear fuel cycle contains a lot of risks if not handled with extreme delicacy, precision, and care, truly. There are a lot of chains of the fuel cycle, and we want to make sure that everyone is protected because when those protections fail or something happens, radioactive contamination is a lot harder to clean up than some other materials that we can deal with. And Utah knows that history far and wide. Um, and we want to make sure if Utah is going to be a site for a nuclear campus, for nuclear reprocessing, for uranium mining and milling, that our communities are protected for today and in the future. So, maybe you don't know that Utah is being pursued for nuclear energy. I'm sure many of you have seen these headlines pop up. I thought that was going to move slower. It didn't. Um, and we have some concerns about it. We understand that there's some hope and real understanding that there can be carbon-free emissions from nuclear power plants. However, if you look at the full life chain of the nuclear fuel chain, there's a lot of other risks that come with it. And we need to think about that as we move forward, especially with a lot of test reactors and different things coming into play. Um, and this is really important because Utah is committing a lot of taxpayer dollars, a lot of energy to bringing nuclear into our state. When we already have a lot of contamination in our state. We're hearing from communities all across the state who are concerned about their health and the effects from radiation and what that means. And we're often seeing that decisions are being made before the communities are even aware of what's going on and not having an opportunity to voice their concerns, express best practices, encourage community benefits agreements, or frankly, to say no. This is something that we're seeing in a resurgence. The speakers and I were just talking about how we've seen all of this before and how it hasn't panned out. And we want to make sure that if things move forward this time around, that they are done with community members in mind and not just industry and bottom dollars. And that is because local impacts are real. This image here is a uranium mine in the La Salles. And you can see someone's goat is going right up to the gate. There's a lot of free range, a lot of Utah's rangelands for cattle and different uh, animals for food could be going into these areas. And we know from experience that radiation in the soil into plants into animals can transfer over to humans. And we want to make sure that while we're hearing federal officials say Utah's been downwind before, so it's okay to let them test nuclear reactors there, that's not the case. We are very concerned about that, and we don't want to be guinea pigs again. We want to make sure that we have a say in our future. Thank you for your time. As I kind of introduce why HEAL is putting this together for Utah specifically, Tim and his organization has done a lot of these. I learned so many. Please go check out their website for more. And Danielle teaches so many awesome things and shows up. So let's kick it off to our experts today. Welcome to Beyond the Reactor, What Nuclear Means for Utah's Future. I want to introduce Tim Judson, the Executive Director of the Nuclear Information Resource Service. Tim joined NIRS September 2013 as Associate Director and has served as Executive Director since 2014. Tim leads their work on nuclear reactor and climate change issues and has written a series of reports on nuclear bailouts and sustainable energy. He is chair of the Board of Citizens Awareness Network and one of the lead organizations in the successful campaign to close the Vermont Yankee reactor and co-founder of Alliance for a Green Economy in New York. Followed by Tim, we'll have Dr. Danielle Andres. She is a professor of communication and director of the Environmental Humanities program at the University of Utah. Her research expertise includes environmental communication, indigenous communication, and rhetorical studies. Her projects have focused on the rhetoric of environmental and science controversies, including nuclear waste siting decisions, climate change, and energy transitions. Her work is guided by principles of democratic participation and focuses on how underrepresented and marginalized groups, particularly Native peoples and nations, engage environmental advocacy. Dr. Andres is the author of Nuclear Decolonization, Indigenous Resistance to High-Level Nuclear Waste Siting, and co-editor of several books. She is currently working on a collaborative project with the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation to collect historical archives in support of the nation's Wuda project. We are so excited to have these two. For all of you joining us today, I've gotten the opportunity to sit and have conversations with these people, which is so special, and I'm so excited to get you all started on our presentation today. So Tim, are you ready to kick it off? Let's make sure you have the capabilities to share screen.
Thanks, Carmen. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here with you, Danielle. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, how does that look?
Sorry, I
Is
was
that
muted. Let me stop my share really quick.
okay?
And Tim, go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. So as Danielle mentioned, I'm the executive director of a group called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. And we're a small national organization that was founded in 1978 to be sort of a resource and networking hub for grassroots organizations and frontline communities that were concerned about the impacts of the nuclear waste, nuclear fuel chain and wanted to see a sustainable energy future. And so, I myself came into this work because I live in Syracuse, New York, 30 miles downwind from three nuclear reactors, which have been affecting my community, since the late 1960s. And so I come to it from that perspective, from the perspective of, communities that have been impacted not just by nuclear power plants, but the whole nuclear fuel chain, which I'm going to talk about more tonight. So, but I thought that it would be good to sort of just get a basic grounding, in sort of what's a nuclear power plant, how do nuclear power plants work, and that'll help understand the various other parts of the nuclear fuel chain that we're going to talk about. So, a nuclear power plant consists of one or more nuclear reactors, which is basically a vessel to contain and control a nuclear chain reaction to generate energy. The fuel that they use, this is at least all reactors that are currently operating in the US and most of the rest of the world today, consists of what's called enriched uranium. The uranium that is in the ground doesn't have enough of the fissile isotope, uranium-235, that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. And so for nuclear reactors, the current ones that are operating, the new kind that they're proposing to build, they have to increase the concentration of uranium 235, which is less than 1% of the natural uranium. It's mostly uranium 238, which can't sustain a chain reaction. So they do that. They make it into fuel rods, and those are installed in a reactor. When they start the nuclear chain reaction, that generates a tremendous amount of heat, but also extremely radioactive waste. But that heat is used to boil water, which then turns a turbine to make electricity. And so, as you can see, there's various types of reactors. The top two that I have listed there are the most common that operate in the U.S. today. They operate at extremely high temperatures and pressures because of the amount of energy that the reactors generate. And so, it's very difficult to keep that reaction under control. And it's remarkable that the industry does it, as successfully as they do it. But when things go wrong, they can go really wrong because of the tremendous forces and energies that are involved in operating a nuclear reactor. And you can see a diagram of what a nuclear fission reaction is, which is essentially it involves neutrons scattering from the decay of uranium 235. Those neutrons hit other nuclei, and then if that atom is fissile, it can split again, releasing more neutrons. And the whole game with operating a nuclear reactor is to be able to regulate and control that reaction so that it doesn't get out of control.
Hey, Tim,
Uh,
real quick, can you share your screen one more time?
sure. Is it not sure?
It was not, I pulled it up, but I want to make sure we're following yours.
Here, let me go get it.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So just to go back to that previous slide, so you can see what I was talking about. There we go. It isn't showing now.
We see it on our end, Tim.
Okay, that's good. Now it's not moving on my end though for some reason. Um, okay.
Anytime there's a Zoom update, I swear.
Yeah. Okay. How's that?
Looks great.
Okay. So yeah, this was the first slide I was showing that goes over the information that I was just talking about. Um, and now it is. Did the slide switch on your end?
It did not.
Okay. There it is. Okay.
There we
That
go.
switch. Okay. So nuclear reactors, because of what I was just talking about, they're really complex machines. They're designed to have, you know, safety systems backing up safety systems, backing up safety systems. And just based on the way that reactors operate, what you see on the right-hand side is a nuclear reactor vessel, which is obviously not just some steel container. There's a tremendous amount of machinery involved in trying to basically provide the ways to control the nuclear chain reaction going on inside the reactor core, where you see the fuel rods in there. Jesus. All right. But then I think what's relevant to some of the discussion we're going to have tonight is that on the bottom right-hand side, you see is essentially what nuclear fuel consists of, which are, these sort of tiny ceramic pellets of uranium oxide that are stacked into fuel rods that are encased in a foil of what's called zirconium cladding. And those fuel rods are bunched into bundles called fuel assemblies, of which there are, dozens or hundreds inside the reactor vessel, that are used to generate all this power. But the uranium doesn't come from nowhere. Just like with fossil fuels, there's a process of extracting the natural materials and then converting them into a usable form for fuel. We call this the nuclear fuel chain or the uranium fuel chain. But it starts with mining uranium out of the ground and then having to refine that into the ore that then has to be shipped to a plant to be converted into a gas that can then go to an enrichment plant to be enriched. Then the enriched uranium gas is sent to a fuel factory to be converted into solid uranium again and made into fuel rods. Then it's sent to a nuclear plant. And so before a single pound of fuel goes into a nuclear reactor, you've already produced thousands of pounds of of radioactive waste from the mining, the milling, and the enrichment and the fuel fabrication. And so there's a tremendous pile of radioactive waste that's created even before a reactor, begins burning the fuel. And so what that looks like is on the front end of the nuclear fuel chain, you have uranium mining, which you've had a lot of in Utah and in the Southwest, where, for every, pound of fuel that goes into the reactor, there's thousands of pounds of waste rock that's basically left and dumped at the mining site. The mined rock is then sent to the uranium mill to be refined into ore. That produces another massive amount of radioactive waste that's, for instance, sitting in these big ponds at the White Mesa site in southeastern Utah. And then the process of enriching the uranium produces many times more what's called depleted uranium waste than what you get out in terms of enriched uranium. And then you have the fuel fabrication, which is then, creating, sort of the fuel rods, but also producing more waste and more pollution. Then what we call the back end starts with the actual use of the fuel at the reactor, which generates a wide stream of radioactive waste. There's one sort of, kind of phrase that I'm fond of is that, electricity is the fleeting byproduct of nuclear power plants, but what they really are is radioactive waste machines. And it's not just the irradiated fuel, the high level waste that people think about. There's numerous streams of radioactive waste that are produced, from nuclear reactors, including routine releases of radioactive gases and liquids, that's part of the normal operation. Then you have leaks and spills and accidents on top of that. There's lots of radioactive waste that have to be sort of packaged up and sent off site to other locations. You have things like the contaminated uniforms that the workers wear that then are sent off to laundries, that are then cleaned, but then the radioactive material that's removed from the clothing then is also radioactive waste. Then at the end of all that, when the reactor shuts down, the decommissioning process starts. And in decommissioning, essentially the entire plant becomes radioactive waste. And so in the decommissioning process, which is extremely expensive and difficult, can cost over $1 billion per reactor. All of the reactor buildings and components, a lot of the soil that's become contaminated is all sent off to be disposed of. And so, for instance, there's radioactive waste from just about every nuclear plant in the country being sent to Utah right now to be dumped in Energy Solutions radioactive waste facility in Clive, Utah. And then after all that's done, you still have the irradiated fuel. That is the stuff that most people think about, for which there's still no permanent storage solution, but that is going to be radioactive for geologic periods of time, and dangerous to the environment. And so that's where I'm mostly going to focus today. But, if you look at the way that this plans out nationally, there are, dozens, if not hundreds of sort of nuclear contaminated sites around the country from these various parts of the fuel chain. In fact, with uranium mining alone, there's over 15,000 abandoned uranium mining sites in the US. It's more than we have McDonald's restaurants, that are essentially, places that aren't being cleaned up. But in terms of licensed radioactive waste sites, they're all over there. Mostly in the West, but also in the East Coast of the country. There's nuclear fuel cycle facilities, spread out across the country as well. And then you have legacy sites like the Manhattan Project sites, where there was production done for making the nuclear bomb during World War II. Where, for instance, in New York, we just had it's a terrible situation come to light last week, where there's a neighborhood that was built on a radioactive waste dump from nuclear materials that may be from the Manhattan Project. In Utah, you don't only have the radioactive waste site in Clive. Also, the White Mesa Mill is being used as a radioactive waste dump for facilities all over the country and in the world right now. There's waste being shipped, from around the world to Clive. I mean, to White Mesa to be dumped in the tailings pond at that site. And so, in terms of how this is sort of regulated, or not regulated in some cases. There are several categories of radioactive waste. There's what's called norm and T-norm, so naturally occurring radioactive material. This is basically waste related to uranium, and also mining and drilling operations. People don't often know that like most gas and oil drilling operations actually produce a lot of radioactive waste. That's because you're drilling into all formations that also have uranium in them. But there's virtually no regulations of those kind of wastes. So there's real problems with the way that those waste products are being disposed of. Then you have the sort of the regulated waste, what's called low-level radioactive waste, which is a broad category for virtually all the radioactive waste that gets disposed of. That's classified into A, B, and C depending on how concentrated it is. But low level is really sort of a misnomer because Class C radioactive waste can be extremely radioactive. I can give you some examples of that. Then there's what's called greater than Class C, which is too radioactive to be categorized as low-level waste, but also isn't the high-level radioactive waste, the irradiated fuel. But it can be as radioactive as that. That greater than Class C doesn't have a place to go right now. It has to be sort of stored as though it's high-level waste. But regulations are being changed right now that could result in that getting dumped in places like Clive. You have what's called transuranic wastes, which are mostly from the Defense Department, from the nuclear weapons program, which are sort of the separated, heavier than uranium isotopes like plutonium, neptunium, americium, and curium that are also very dangerous environmentally. And so those are being disposed of mostly at a site in New Mexico called WIP that is being used for defense program waste. And then you have what's called the high level waste, which is essentially the irradiated nuclear fuel, which is intensely radioactive and long lived, and waste from the reprocessing of that irradiated fuel. Now, there's lots of different types of reactors being talked about now, but almost the entire inventory of irradiated fuel that we have now is from what's called, what I call conventional fuel, which I was describing before. It's called spent not because it's not radioactive, but because it's not useful for using in the reactor anymore. But what happens in the process of using the fuel rods is that they become millions and millions of times more radioactive than they were when they went in. In fact, when a fuel rod comes out of a reactor, it's lethally radioactive. It can kill you within seconds. They're also intensely hot because of all that radioactive material that's still decaying. That takes, over hundreds of years potentially for them to cool enough to not require active cooling. And the fuel rods contain, dozens, if not hundreds of radioisotopes from the splitting of atoms, from the activation of atoms, with absorbing neutrons that are flying around, the creation of these transatomic isotopes. There's the fuel rod itself becomes sort of a soup of radioactive material. There's a lot of talk, especially in Utah, about reprocessing the fuel. Sometimes it's really sort of mislabeled as recycling. Reprocessing is not recycling. There's only 1% of what's in the spent fuel or irradiated fuel is recoverable and useful for making other nuclear fuel. But reprocessing is basically a chemical process to do that, to basically break down these fuel rods and then extract the little bit of fissile isotopes that are left in them, to put into new fuel rods. There's two basic technologies for this. One is what's been used, around the world since the Cold War. It's the aqueous process, which is basically dissolving the fuel rods in acid and then going through several chemical steps that you see on this chart on the bottom right, to extract what's useful plutonium that could be used as fuel or in bombs, which is what makes this also really dangerous in terms of nuclear weapons proliferation. There's a new technology that isn't commercially proven yet, but is being talked about a lot, and they're doing some demonstration projects right now called pyroprocessing, which essentially, doesn't dissolve the fuel rods in acid, but still produces a lot of will still produce a lot of radioactive waste. One of the things to know about reprocessing is also that it's really impractical. It's very uneconomical to reprocess the fuel. The nuclear industry isn't actually interested in reprocessing for that reason, to make their fuel more expensive. But also, because of, the way that reprocessing works, you can only reprocess fuel once to use in a conventional reactor. There's only one way for there to be, an ability to reprocess the fuel more than once. But those types of reactors have never proved economically feasible. Those are called breeder reactors. But from a practical standpoint, reprocessing is really not a practical or economic way for the industry to operate. This is sort of being pushed because it's sort of part of, the dream of making a sustainable nuclear industry, but it has never really worked that way. And what you see is across the industry with reprocessing, each site that has done reprocessing has become sort of a radioactive disaster area. We see this, in the U.S., especially with like the Hanford Nuclear Reservation and a number of nuclear weapons production sites like Savannah River as well. The only commercial reprocessing facility that ever operated in the US is in New York at a site called West Valley, which only operated for a few years, but has taken now more than 40 years and billions of dollars, and it's not even cleaned up yet. But internationally, you have the same story repeated at the Windscale plant in, the United Kingdom, which has been polluting the Irish Sea. It also had a major disaster in 1957. The Russians, had their largest disaster before Chernobyl at the Chelyabinsk Mayak site, where they also dumped a tremendous amount of radioactive waste in the Techa River. And also the Le Havre reprocessing site in France, which is frequently cited as the glory, sort of the greatest example of reprocessing, is hardly operating anymore, but has dumped, a lot of radioactive waste into the English Channel and the sea. Now, when you're talking about having a reprocessing site, what you're really talking about is also setting up what's called consolidated interim storage of the irradiated fuel from these nuclear power plants. You have to get waste from all these nuclear plants to the site and then prepare it to go through the reprocessing process. Utah stopped a CIS facility from being built, over 20 years ago, because essentially it was recognized that this was going to be both really dangerous and it was going to leave Utah open to becoming a de facto nuclear waste dump. Because the reality is that the U.S. repository program for a permanent disposal site has failed, and they aren't working on it anymore. And so, whoever gets a CIS site is really signing up to be a de facto nuclear dump for the foreseeable future. The other aspect of this is also the transportation of all this intensely radioactive waste throughout the country. And so, to operate either a CIS site or a reprocessing facility, you're talking about thousands of railroad and barge shipments of this intensely radioactive waste from throughout the country, in containers that would, that with the fuel rods inside them would have as much intensely radioactive material as the Chernobyl nuclear accident released. And that's just sort of what that would look like. This is a map of what the transportation scheme for delivering all this irradiated fuel to the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada for the proposed permanent repository. Most of it was going to go through Utah anyway. So if Utah were to become a reprocessing site, this is sort of what that could look like for Utah as well. Now, there's a lot of talk about advanced reactors, and as though there's some groundbreaking potential in the technology that's being developed right now. This is sort of a PR campaign. There's no consistent definition of what an advanced reactor is, and the way that they're applying the term, it basically covers anything that isn't a currently operating nuclear reactor, whether that's, new versions of light water reactors, like boiling water and pressurized water reactors, various kinds of non-light water reactors that use different types of coolant, whether it's molten salt or liquid sodium or helium. There's what they call SMRs, or small modular reactors, which are, intended to be sort of factory-built, mass-produced reactors that would be essentially built at a factory and then shipped to a reactor site to be operated. and then even smaller, what they call micro reactors, which would be the same scheme, but with a essentially like a use it once type of reactor that would then be delivered to a reactor site, used for a few years, and then sent back to the place where it was built. There's a lot of so the claims that are being made about these reactors are don't really measure up to the facts. So this is from a report by the Union of Concerned Scientists that evaluated the various types of advanced reactors that are being talked about. There's trade-offs in some ways with different types of impacts that they have. But overall, what you can see is that there's no clear advantage that these reactors would have over the current types that we have operating in the country right now. There's still a lot of safety problems. There's still potential problems with nuclear proliferation and terrorist attacks, and then problems with radioactive waste storage and inefficiency. But in terms of kind of what Utah could be signing up for if it goes forward with these proposals, is that there's various new types of fuel that are proposed for these kinds of reactors that haven't been used conventionally. Um, you know, the basic sort of what this boils down to, though, is that these new types of reactors would produce more radioactive waste per unit of energy than the current types of reactors produce. And there's reasons of physics behind that, which we can go into if people have questions. Problem is also that there's a wave of deregulation hitting the industry really, really rapidly right now based on the actions of the Trump administration. This is just sort of a summary of the headlines that have happened over the last year and the developments that have taken place. There's a whole sweeping change, all of the entire code of regulations governing nuclear power that's being pushed through right now. That is it's very concerning to see how this is playing out. The Department of Energy is actually pretending as though it has the authority to approve construction of reactors without going through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a license. We believe that this is actually illegal under the Atomic Energy Act, and poses really serious safety concerns. They've also adopted a policy that says that these DOE approved reactors don't require environmental reviews at all. Based on a lot of fallacious assumptions. One of the reasons that we should be concerned about this is that it seems like we are replicating what went wrong in Japan that led to the Fukushima disaster in 2011. And so this quote is from a report that the Japanese Parliament commissioned in the year after the accident to find out why. And what they concluded was that the root cause of the disaster at Fukushima was not just the earthquake and the tsunami, which precipitated it, but the fact that the regulators ignored the risks of that in the years before because it was convenient for the industry, and that they didn't have an independent regulator, and they were sort of consumed by this myth they called the safety myth that a bad accident couldn't happen. And so they swept away the concerns that had been raised about the very thing that happened at Fukushima in the years beforehand. So I'll stop there for now, and then if I can talk about other concerns that communities have after the discussion.
Thank you, Tim, and everyone. We will record all of these, and I'm sure Tim would also be willing to help share their slides. I think both of our speakers will. There is so much knowledge, and trying to pack that all in is really tough. So thank you so much, Tim. And feel free to add questions into the chat, and we will get to them in our Q&A. But now we're going to hand it over to Dr. Danielle Andres. And let me know when you're ready, and I will proceed forward with the slides.
I'm ready. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this evening at whatever time it is for you. I am going to talk a little bit more detail about how all of this has impacted and will potentially impact Utah with some new proposals that the state government is working on. I do want to say that I'm a professor at the University of Utah, and all of what I'll present today is based on my expertise, my research expertise in the social and environmental impacts of nuclear waste siting. And then my views and my expertise is not necessarily representative of the entire University of Utah. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So to pick up on some of the information that Tim was providing, just to get an understanding of what is nuclear waste and what is this fuel cycle. You can see on here kind of a diagram that shows all of those, that entire life cycle that Tim was talking about. And so radioactive waste is really any unusable byproducts of nuclear technologies. And that can range even outside of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. That can be byproducts that come from X-rays, and there are lots of ways that society uses radiation. But the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission specifically defines nuclear waste as a subset of that that's focused on the byproducts of the entire nuclear fuel cycle. And that's what Tim went over earlier. And so it starts with uranium. There's some proposals to do some new types of reactors based on thorium and reprocessing, which Tim was talking about. And then it ends with nuclear waste. And so that's essentially the cycle. And even reprocessing, as you can see in the diagram, doesn't completely remove nuclear waste from the cycle. So we can go to the next slide, please. So Tim talked through these, so I won't spend a lot of time here on the different levels of nuclear waste classifications. These are the classifications for the US. If you look globally, worldwide, you would probably see high level, intermediate level, and low level waste, but these are specific to our context here in the US. A couple of things that I want to point out. If we look at high level radioactive waste, though it is a small percentage of the volume of waste that's produced, and that's because, as Tim was talking about, like that low level waste category includes, uniforms and gloves and things like that are at a very low level of radiation. So there's a lot of volume of stuff that is in that category. It's still dangerous, but not as dangerous as high level waste. But within that, smaller volume, this is 95% of the radioactivity that we need to worry about in terms of managing our nuclear waste. When we get down to the low level waste, again, that's about 90% of the volume, 90% of the volume, and at about 1% of the radioactivity. So all levels of radioactive waste need to be safely contained and pose risks to the environment. My expertise has been on high-level nuclear waste, and that's because that's one of the more dangerous forms of nuclear waste. If you're trying to add up those percentages, the other 7%, so this is a global statistic, the other 7% is that intermediate level waste, which would cover our transuranic and our uranium melt tailings in the US classifications. So we currently in the state, as Tim mentioned, host many old uranium mines and mill tailings, the White Mesa Mill. And we also have Energy Solutions, which is one of several companies in the US that stores low-level nuclear waste. So we can move to the next slide. So then just to put it all together, what are the forms of nuclear waste that are coming from nuclear power? So this entire life cycle, as Tim was talking about, produces it. So we've got the mining and milling. We have the reactor designs that are producing low and high level nuclear waste. And then these proposed advanced nuclear reactors, which Tim did a great job of talking about, that includes a lot of different things, are also going to produce these levels of waste. So we can go to the next one. So what are some of the social and environmental impacts of nuclear waste? Some of the things that we're worried about in terms of human and ecological health are groundwater pollution, broader ecological pollution, getting into plant life, animal life, and then, of course, human health. And we see cancers, immune diseases, and other issues that arise. And those depend on the level of radioactivity of the waste, at what point a human or the environment is encountering that. So it can really range across the different types of nuclear waste, but those are some of the things that we worry about. The EPA tells us that radioactive waste is hazardous because it contains or emits radioactive particles, which, if not properly managed, can be a risk to human health and the environment. And so that proper management is so important and is a key to ensuring human health and the environment. As I'll talk about in a future slide, the point that Tim was making about deregulation is a major concern as we think about future advances in nuclear power. There's a history of inequity in siting decisions or environmental injustices. My specialty or my expertise is in nuclear colonization or nuclear decolonization, where indigenous communities, both in the US and globally, have been disproportionately negatively impacted by all cycles of that nuclear fuel cycle, and yet are not receiving very many benefits from it. So the benefits are going to other communities, to corporations and things like that. And then the harms are being disproportionately experienced by indigenous communities. A great example from our region is the years and years of uranium mining on Navajo Nation or Dene lands that resulted in massive ecological and human health issues. Carmen mentioned in the beginning the Rio Porco accident, one of the biggest nuclear accidents in the US, and that primarily affected Navajo Nation. So accidents, deregulation, trying to plan over geologic time. To be honest, trying to plan longer than human society has really, like, human communication patterns have existed. And then political and social instability are all risks for safe containment. So, no one who is involved in any of these conversations will deny that we need strategies to safely contain the waste that has already been produced. And I think the question that I encourage folks to think about is, if we haven't yet safely contained all of our waste, is it a good idea? Is it prudent to continue to produce more and more waste with advancing nuclear power? So we can go to the next. Okay, so what types of waste are already present in Utah? We have these retired uranium mining and milling sites. We have an old site in Moab, which is a Superfund site. I have it in my notes, but I can't remember what the UMTRA stands for, but you can look that up. It's basically a name for the project. And those wastes are so close to the Colorado River that they're actually being moved away to decrease the risk of contaminating the Colorado River, which is a major source of water for our region. So that's just one example. We have active mill tailings at the Energy Fuels Mill in White Mesa. And then, of course, we have the Class A low-level waste facility at Energy Solutions in Clive, Utah. It is important to note that most of what the state government is proposing is a move forward with nuclear power, new forms of nuclear power plants. Of course, some of the uranium mining and milling contributed to nuclear weapons, not nuclear energy. So that's just important to specify. It's really interesting that at times, rhetorically, and that's my area of expertise, so the ways that we communicate things, sometimes it's in the interest of someone to connect nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and sometimes it's in the interest to kind of separate those out. They are inherently connected in many, many ways, as technologies that kind of followed similar paths, but they're also very different in really important ways, and I'm happy to talk about some of those differences. Okay, next slide. So Energy Solutions is our primary current low-level nuclear waste site. You can see kind of on the map, it's out in Tooele. County, and their most recent kind of campaign is based on the Mission Impossible movies, and they're articulating what they're doing as Mission Possible. So Energy Solutions is really putting forward a lot of arguments and campaigns to increase the services that they can provide to support an increase of nuclear energy and nuclear power. They're currently only licensed to store Class A low-level waste. That's the very lowest level. Tim was talking about the C and the more than C. Those are not currently allowed to be stored at Energy Solutions. However, in the past, Energy Solutions has tried to, feel out expanding to Class B and C level waste, is engaged in the greater than level C. They've sought to import foreign waste, and in fact, recently it's been approved to bring in waste from Canada, and they have reprocessing technology. So they're part of their Mission Possible is proposing that they can facilitate reprocessing if the United States would move to reprocessing. I don't think Tim mentioned it, but the reason that the US doesn't reprocess currently is that it had been outlawed by several presidents in the past, and that was because of worries of increased proliferation risks. So the way that reprocessing works allows for more byproducts that are more easily turned into fissionable weapons. And so for years and years and years, the United States has had a policy of not pursuing reprocessing, and Trump has reversed that. So we can go to the next one. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of high-level nuclear waste storage and why that's important. That's, again, my expertise area. So all of this is governed by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, passed in 1982 and has been amended several times. Ronald Reagan was the president at that time who signed the law into effect. And through this, the federal government essentially subsidizes the nuclear power industry by taking responsibility for long-term storage of nuclear waste in a centralized geologic storage facility. I will talk a little bit more about this. This has not come to fruition, and currently the spent fuel rods are currently stored on site at nuclear reactors, either in pools. As Tim was saying, they need to cool down, and once they're cool, they can be moved into casks, which are basically like kind of engineered barriers to contain the radiation. And we have about 90,000 metric tons of high-level waste, which is increasing every year. You can go to the next one. So we, for many, many years, evaluated a federal site at Yucca Mountain. This was widely by people on multiple sides of the issue of nuclear waste. It's pretty much been determined by most sides that this was a political site more than a scientific site. The scientific feasibility of that site was not actually as good as some other geologic features for containing waste. It's a kind of a case study in the failure of nuclear waste policy in the United States, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. Next slide. So Tim mentioned this briefly, but one of the cases that I cover in my book is about the private fuel storage site, which was to be located on the Skull Valley Goshute Reservation. This was a consortium of energy companies that were frustrated with the federal government that there was not a storage site yet. And so they worked with Skull Valley to get a license to have an interim waste facility. This is really important. The state of Utah fought very strongly to not allow this storage site. Also members of the Skull Valley Nation, so the Skull Valley government was in support of it, but members of the Skull Valley Nation fought against this. Utah's congressional representation, Orrin Hatch, for those of you that remember the Orrin Hatch days, was a strong not supporter of this site. So many resisted the site. It was granted a license. Then there was some more decisions by the Department of Interior that sort of stalled it. And then ultimately PFS won an appeal, but then decided that they wouldn't pursue that site anymore. So these were the two sites for high-level nuclear waste that got the closest to fruition, and both of them failed. So we can go to the next slide. So after that, this recognized failure in policy over nuclear waste siting, the Obama administration put forth a Blue Ribbon Commission to decide what's the best way to handle high-level nuclear waste. The Government Accountability Office has also done a lot of research on this. And so the consensus formed around what's called consent-based siting, which means instead of imposing a site on a community, that consent and community collaboration is built in from the very start of the process. So that's kind of the recognized way that the United States federal government is seeking to fulfill their obligations in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And we can move to the next slide. That is being challenged by a new initiative called the Nuclear Life Cycle Innovation Campuses. And this comes out of President Trump released a series of executive orders that promote continued growth of nuclear power. And the Life Cycle Innovation Campuses are seeking voluntary state and federal partnerships to address the full life cycle of nuclear power. And this is aligned with Trump's vision for revitalized nuclear renaissance. This was launched in 2026, so this is very recent. And if you'll go to the next slide. Utah has put in a bid for a nuclear life cycle innovation campus in Tooele County. And I really encourage everybody to actually read this proposal. I can share a link later, or I'm sure that Heel has a link to this document. So the state and Tooele County came together to propose this campus. They're proposing enrichment, fuel fabrication, reprocessing. As I said, Energy Solutions, which is in Tooele County, has reprocessing technology and nuclear waste storage. And so the nuclear life cycle innovation campuses are not solely about high-level nuclear waste storage, but they are also about high-level nuclear waste storage. So this was the most surprising thing to me when I first read the proposal, because I figured that the proposal was going to be more about advancing small modular reactors, advancing these new types of nuclear that the state has been promoting in its energy plan. But really, the proposal is to bring reprocessing and high-level nuclear waste to Tooele, to the Energy Solutions site. So they've submitted in March of 2026 and are awaiting response. And then if accepted, this could bring high-level nuclear waste and spent nuclear fuel to Utah, in addition to the low-level waste that is already being stored at Energy Solutions. So we can go to the next slide. So I think I've got just 2 more slides to wrap this up. I wanted to address a couple of common misunderstandings about nuclear waste. The first is that nuclear waste is only a scientific and technical issue. Of course, we need the scientific and technical expertise. We could not safely contain the radiation from nuclear waste without scientific and technical expertise, but it's not enough. Policy decisions are based on social, political, and ecological issues. And for that reason, we need to ensure that any decision that is made about nuclear waste is not just a scientific and technical decision, but is also a decision that considers equity and considers environmental justice and considers the communities that would be hosting these facilities. The second one is advanced nuclear and small modular reactors produce little to no waste. Tim also cited this study. It's a great study out of scholars at Stanford University and the University of British Columbia, who say that these small modular reactors could actually produce a higher volume of nuclear waste. So if you're hearing the way that the state or the way that industry is talking about advanced nuclear or small modular reactors, they're saying they solve the waste problem. And this study shows that they actually increase the waste problem. And then again, reprocessing is billed as a solution to nuclear waste, but this is a quote from Alison McFarlane, who is the former NRC chair and a professor at University of British Columbia. And she says, building expensive prototypes of reactors whose fuel requires reprocessing on the belief that such reactors will solve the nuclear waste problem in America is misguided. And she goes on to explain all of the kind of problems, again, with the extra waste that's being produced out of these. So next slide. So how can you get engaged? If you're here in Utah, or if you're nearby, you should read the State of Utah's Nuclear Life Cycle Innovation Campus proposal. As soon as I finish, I'll put a link in the chat of that. Democratic participation in decision-making about energy in Utah is the most important thing. We are seeing limitations on democratic public participation. We're seeing patterns where the government and corporations are often providing public hearing and public participation processes, but they're not super in depth. But we still have to take advantage of our access to be participants in decision making. All of us need to make decisions about energy in Utah and what energy sources are most important to us. You should seek out information from the EPA, NRC, GAO, Department of Energy on nuclear waste. And of course, there are so many other academic sources and groups that are working on this. There's great information out there. Critically engage with all sources and any potential biases that can come out of those, including what you're hearing from me. The key here is that we're critical thinkers and that we're evaluating information, and we're thinking and diving into actual academic research that's going to support these decisions. And then I would just ask you all to ask with every proposal for nuclear, who's benefiting from it and who is harmed. And there's the cover of my book. My book focuses on the Yucca Mountain waste siting decision and the PFS Skull Valley waste siting decision. And again, my expertise is really on the interface between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. So if you want to dig more deeply into that, take a look at my book. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. I am going to pause our recording now for questions. Zoom recording. So what now? You're here, you're learning about it. We're excited about that. There's a lot of work. Good luck reading that proposal. It's, Daniel, I think 180 pages. But it's important. If you care about your community, it's important to stay engaged. I know we are all dealing with so much going on right now. So reach out to organizations like HEAL, like our series partners, like Tim, like Danielle, your health experts. Reach out to your legislators, ask questions. And we have some suggestions. We need to be thinking about the cost, especially when it comes to nuclear reprocessing and developing that ecosystem. When it's going to become available, can we afford to wait? This kind of relates to our nuclear power plants, but recognizing that those sites will have radioactive waste on site. So is it bringing benefit to the community? Our speakers kind of thought about that, right? Are we getting benefits, or are we bearing the brunt of the burden? Do we have operators and experience in building and operating reactors and reprocessing plants? Where is this waste going to be stored if we create a national repository? Who's bearing those continued burdens of expanded uranium mining and milling? How are we being included in decision making? And are there alternatives that we could be pursuing that don't create more of this waste to need reprocessing? And to really sum up, as we were saying, right, we have a lot of questions, we have a lot of speculations. We need answers from our decision makers and industry leaders. We need you listening to our concerns and not just saying we've solved it. We need to see in practice that this is something you are taking seriously. And we need independent studies. We need comparisons between energy sources and economic opportunities and what we're spending our money on if reprocessing is economical for our state. We need representation. Consent-based siting is still a very small consent. Not everyone is going to be in favor or against, so we need to make sure there's strong representation. And something we have been highlighting is that strong independent oversight from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission without weakening health protections, as well as from our states, from our industry leaders. Don't do the bare minimum. Always do above and beyond to protect your communities that you may be impacting. And HEAL is trying to do all that by hosting conversations like this. We continue asking important questions to your legislators, to you as community members, to industries, to experts. We monitor legislation and regulation. We've seen several congressional bills come through relating to this. We're seeing things happening with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And we're trying to build a coalition of informed, empowered organizations, experts, and community members like you to show that we're standing together and we have questions, we need answers in order to pursue this. And as people who live in Utah, born and raised in Utah, families born and raised, are downwinders, and those loved ones who suffered from cancers and illnesses are still something that we deal with to this day. And so we have been pushing that work. We want you to consider filling out this survey, whether or not you are in support or against or concerned or have questions. Let us know how you feel about nuclear, as well as check out our map we have created. This is not a holistic map. We are still adding things to it. It is a map of existing sites, proposed sites, the current buffer zones in case accidents happens on facilities. These might be changing with NRC regulations, as well as proximities to our schools and our fire stations and our places of worship. We do know that there's only one team in the entire state of Utah that can handle a high-level radioactive waste issue. And so that can mean the difference of how our communities are protected. So these are two different QR codes. We'll share those links in the chat as well. But we just want you to know that we're here. We want to hear from you guys. We want to hear what we can do to develop these best community practices. We also want to support you in speaking up to your decision makers. I know at this time it feels like you're yelling at a brick wall sometimes, but keep sharing the information, keep reaching out, keep expressing how these possible reprocessing, transportation, storing high-level radioactive waste can affect your communities. And then there was the release of a proposed rule change for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that would change and weaken radiation protections on people and workers and our communities. Essentially, it would increase the allowable radiation doses per year. And even in certain circumstances, we do not need to be weakening these regulations at a time where we are pursuing all of the above nuclear options. So please reach out. I will grab that link for you all as well really quick. And make your voices heard. These are things that'll live with us for the rest of our lifetime and then our children's lifetime and our children's. And we literally do not know how long these materials will remain radioactive and harmful to living cells. So this is an important part of protecting for our future. We know there's changes coming. We know there's pursuit of high-level radioactive waste coming into our state. And we know there will be dedications of locations that are sacred, that are significant to our families within our state, that'll be open to uranium mining, that have just been reopened. So stay involved, stay engaged as much as you can during this time. And the second to last thing, I'll drop our post-event survey. We want to know how we did, if this was a good format, if you learned something, what else you may have questions on. So you can use the QR code, or I just dropped a link. Roger, yep, there's a lot of conversations we can have. Reach out, which is, I guess I have 2 more slides. Come join our other events moving forward. They're not all really difficult to process, but we have fun things coming on. As I mentioned, those downwinders, the entire state of Utah is now eligible because of science showing that the entire state was blanketed in many, many nuclear fallouts from nuclear weapons testing. So find us to submit your application. Personal story, once that expansion was in place, my grandma now qualifies. So I helped grandma gather all of her materials to go through that process. So share with people who lived in Utah during that time. And last, we want to say thank you. We know it's summer. We know it's getting late for you, Tim, and those on our East Coast. But we want to thank you for joining us and for having questions and from learning. Be on the lookout on our action alerts, on our website, sign up. And we are a nonprofit. If you would like to ensure that we can make it to communities for RECA or town halls or different things like that, we are a nonprofit, and we are strong but mighty. And just want to thank you all, Carmen, Senior Policy Associate, and just grateful for all your time today. Round of virtual applause for our speakers today and all their time. Seriously, if you liked what you were hearing or want to know more, these people are incredible and always respond to my emails no matter what, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you everyone for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and we will go ahead, stop recording, and all of you have a great rest of your evening.